October 21st, 2025, 2:35. The sky over Bryansk was black, empty, and silent until the cockpit alarms erupted. Missile lock. The Su-24 pilot yanked the stick, forcing the aircraft into a screaming dive. Gravity crushed his chest. The co-pilot hammered the chaff and flares, spraying heat and metal into the night. An S-300 missile tore past their canopy and detonated in the dark, missing them by seconds. Death had just passed overhead. The real strike had already begun. Moments earlier, the two aging Su-24s had released 4 Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Each is nearly 5 meters long. Those were carrying a 450-kilogram tandem warhead meant to break bunkers. 1,800 kilograms of explosive force was now moving across Russia at treetop height, absolutely unseen. And those missiles were headed for the heart of Russia's rocket war, the explosives plant at Selzo. This was no ordinary raid, but a vein cut. Selzo was where Russia mixed, cast, and refined the solid propellant that feeds its artillery and long-range missile programs. Grad salvos, Smerch barrages, Iskander launches, and Kaliber strikes on Ukrainian cities. All of them depended on the chemicals produced in this complex. So, you can say that if artillery is the roar of the Russian army, Selzo is the oxygen in its lungs. For 2 years, this facility stayed untouched. Not because Ukraine couldn't find it, but because Ukraine was never supposed to reach it. It sat deep behind the border, buried under overlapping radar networks and protected by S-300 and S-400 intercept zones. Moscow believed distance was armor and layered defense was certainty. But ironically, belief is where strategy ends, and reality is where it breaks. Tonight, at 2:35, reality was on approach. Hours before the strike, Russia believed it understood the night. Air defense crews in Bryansk were tracking swarms of cheap drones coming from multiple directions. They had been doing this for weeks. They were tired, confident, and numb to alerts that should have mattered. Every radar screen was crowded with small signatures moving at inconsistent speeds and low altitudes. This was not accidental. Ukraine had launched a saturation wave first to drown perception. Bober drones, UJ-22s, converted S-200s, and modified rockets all crossed the border at staggered intervals. Operators did what they were trained to do. They fired and triaged threats by quantity. The system responded exactly as expected, and that was the mistake. The Russian command, watching from Moscow, decided the storm was already being contained. Screens showed interceptions, while batteries were spending missiles. Logs were filled with engagement reports. Seeing those, they believed they were winning the exchange. However, the actual damage was happening in their decision architecture. The overload was slow, invisible, and irreversible once set in motion. Every commander that night had to decide what mattered most: protect the border, Moscow, infrastructure, and of course, the war machine. When every direction looks like a threat, the priority list fractures. And that fracture is where the corridor opened, in the mind of the defense. This was a moment designed where the strike would be invisible, because attention had already been stolen. You see, Ukraine never broke the defenses. Russia looked away. The Su-24s did not take off. They launched. Engines screamed. Afterburners punched the night, and the pilots forced the aircraft down low, so low that the ground filled the windows more than the sky did. There was no room for hesitation. At this altitude, mistakes are paid for. 2 electronic warfare drones led the way, shaping the air picture in front of them. They jammed exactly what needed to be confused. Just enough signal noise to make the Su-24s look like background clutter. Not a threat or priority. Just another ghost in a night full of ghosts. The pilots flew with their chests tight against the harness. Altitude, 45 to 60 meters. Speed, Mach 0.8. Margin for error, none. Every bump of terrain needed to be anticipated before it appeared, and every sudden spike on the RWR meant potential death from a direction they couldn't see. And then it happened. S-300 tracking radar had burned through the interference. There was no time to think. The pilot slammed the aircraft into a hard brake turn, pulling G that narrowed the field of vision into a tunnel. The co-pilot was already hitting the chaff and flare triggers like a code he had memorized since training. The missile streaked past overhead, close enough to rattle the canopy, and close enough that instinct believes it touched you. The plane survived. But the mission wasn't about the Su-24s. It was about what they had already released. The launch window opened. The coordinates rolled green on the panel. 4 Storm Shadow missiles dropped away, engines lighting a heartbeat later. They slipped to treetop height, masked by terrain, silent to radar, and invisible to operators still fighting decoys. The Su-24s turned home, low and silent, leaving the night behind them. The hunters were already inside Russia. Now, can you guess which mattered more in this moment? Altitude or timing? While the Storm Shadows raced low across the terrain, Russia was busy fighting the wrong battle. The air defense grid from Bryansk to Kursk was still saturated with decoys. Drones falling, burning, spinning, and crashing across fields and suburbs. Radar operators were swamped by returns that looked real, moved real, and forced real reactions. Every intercepted decoy costs time, while every second costs awareness. Command centers were receiving overlapping orders. Protect Moscow, save facilities, hold the border, prioritize speed, and too many priorities is another word for none. And that was the corridor. Storm Shadows do not announce themselves. They approach as a shape, like a shadow under the radar horizon, gliding quietly and letting terrain break the line of sight. By the time filtered returns began to show faint movement, the screens were already full of noise. No one could tell which contact mattered. One operator marked a track. Another dismissed it as a drone reflection. A third switched to a different console entirely because alarms were hitting faster than they could be cleared. This was not a failure of equipment anymore. It was a failure of human bandwidth. The defense network was still functioning. The radars were still rotating, and the interceptors were ready to launch. But recognition requires focus, and that was gone. Storm Shadows slipped through because Russia was overwhelmed and pointed at the wrong fight. The missiles were now inside Bryansk Oblast, approaching Selzo, seconds from terminal phase guidance. No one in the command chain understood what was coming yet. The Storm Shadows entered the final stretch, still at treetop height. Their guidance systems switched from terrain matching to infrared imaging. The target was no longer a coordinate. It was a shape, a heat signature, and a known interior layout stored in memory. Selzo was awake, but confused. Warning lights were flashing, but no one knew what for. Some believed the threat was still at the border. Others thought the alerts were a spillover from the drone swarms. Missile 1 traced a shallow climb, then dove, striking the mixing hall. The leading charge punched through the roof. The main warhead detonated inside the chamber, where solid fuel slurry was refined. The blast hollowed the building from within. Missile 2 hit the storage hangar where finished rocket fuel blocks were stacked for transport. The explosion ignited everything inside. The second detonation was a chain reaction. A shockwave rolled outward, shaking windows across Bryansk. Missile 3 selected the casting unit. It only needed to break alignment. Once the machinery lost calibration, the entire facility became unusable for months, maybe longer. Every fire truck, security siren, and commander who ran to the scene saw the same thing. A facility still shaped like a factory, but without a pulse. Russia's war machine had just lost its oxygen supply. Selzo supported the entire rhythm of Russia's artillery war. When it went silent, the change started at the very edge of the front. Artillery units that once fired ruthlessly received new instructions to conserve. Batteries that were used to send out full salvos were told to fire in half measures. In some sectors, firing was paused entirely unless targets were verified and strategically necessary. The tempo that once defined Russian pressure began to slow in uneven, visible steps. The crews at the front felt it first. By the time the reality reached the general staff in Moscow, the transformation was already in motion. This was not a temporary disruption. Chemical production at this scale does not restart with a repair crew and a checklist. The machinery needs recalibration. The casting rooms need controlled environments. And most importantly, the technicians require specialized experience. None of that can be replaced quickly or cheaply. A damaged bridge can be rebuilt. A radar station can be replaced. Even a lost battery can be redeployed. But the loss of a production node that feeds the entire chain changes the shape of the war. Russia can still fire, but it cannot fire at the pace it once believed it could sustain. And pace is what turns pressure into dominance. The war Selzo supported was forced to breathe slower. The fallout reached Moscow before the fires in Bryansk stopped burning. Selzo's loss forced an immediate recalculation. Artillery schedules were rewritten. Rocket allocations were reduced. Commanders who once ordered barrages now asked whether they could afford them. The war's tempo slowed because it had to, not because anyone chose restraint. Inside closed rooms, officials understood that distance was no longer protection. The war had crossed from front lines into strategic depth. The night ended, but the war didn't. We watch what comes next. Now, can you guess what gets hit next? Ammo depots or airfields? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and stay tuned.